Mark, it's an honor to be here with you on stage at Ad Week. Is the microphone working?
There we go.
Nice.
Thank you.
So, in your role, you've done some incredible things at Pepsi. The Fuel Tomorrow campaign for Gatorade, No Sugar Challenge, huge brand platforms, really successful. We all know how much time, energy, and investment goes into launching campaigns like that. There's a ton at stake. We're in a world right now where, with channels like live sports, there are 15 different networks and streaming platforms that are broadcasting the games. All of those different channels are reaching consumers across multiple different devices. And a lot of those consumers are using multiple devices within any given broadcast. So the fragmentation is getting out of control, and it presents a lot of challenges for marketers like you. So first question is, with multifaceted campaigns that are spanning TV, video, digital, and social, how do you go about determining what your goals and KPIs are going to be?
First off, I think you just scared every college kid from ever wanting to do marketing. Look, the reality is it's not linear anymore, and there's kind of a pun intended in terms of linear TV because that's changed massively as well. Marketing as a craft or as a function is more dynamic, more diverse, and every generation of CMOs will say this, but it is you cannot think about your consumer, your customer, a channel the same in the last 5 to 10 years. And every year it multiplies. So if I think about how do I measure KPIs, there's no such thing as one KPI. We used to think about ROI and maybe wear out because we were an above the line, awareness driving, TV centric organization, culture, industry. Now I have to think of engagement. I have to think of the individual equity results of influencers. I have to think of how do I tie that into sales. I have to think of things like first-time pick rate. Who knows what that is? That's what happens when a Walmart person goes around the outside of a store and fills their online order. You have to think about so many different KPIs that are ultimately influenced by omni-channel marketing. So yes, I need to be at equity and awareness in the top of the funnel. Yes, I need to drive engagement and shares and likes and all the kind of middle funnel conversion type things. And yes, I got to sell a lot of product in new channels and dynamics. 25% of Walmart's growth in the past year has actually come from online. And if you think about them as just one retailer, you got to think of them more as like a large country for many of us that are their customers. So you have to think of, so imagine if 25% of your sales shift to a channel. You have to think about if 25% of your media shifts to a channel. And you have to think about how am I then incentivizing consumers to shop in those channels. So there is no one KPI. And by the way, and for a lot of the emerging channels, there aren't any great, perfect KPIs. So I think continuous experimentation, continuous curiosity, and also the one thing that's super important is we must partner much closely with our media partners, our agencies, and our customers to share data. Because if we don't do that, then we're talking to ourselves. Then we're fundamentally disconnected from the realities of how consumers shop, how consumers embrace your message, and ultimately how we all make money.
Makes sense. So you mentioned a lot of KPIs that factor into the overall success of any given marketing campaign, especially in TV and video at this point. How has the evolution, kind of been driven by the fragmentation in how you think about success and what needs to be measured?
I think the evolution was driven initially by the industry. Like the industry, when I say collectively, media companies, brands, retailers shifted behavior through how we advertised. Now it's actually driven by consumers and technology platforms, and frankly, by algorithms. The reality is today that we are actually, I was having this conversation earlier today, as a marketer, I need to understand both my audience and how they think, what they like, how they, what their emotional connections are to my brand. I also need to understand algorithms and agents. Because, perfect example, Abercrombie, 25% of all of the posts and comments were actually bots. So if I don't understand how those bots work, and by the way, their stock soared. So it was an amazing example of how what looks like a bad thing ended up being a good thing. But I think what's interesting is that 25% driven by bots. How do those bots interact? And how is it going to change how I spend money? How is it going to change how I actually think differently about media and my overall marketing mix? And all of that, the reality is what's happening is it can impact any part of the funnel. It can affect your brand equity. It can affect sales and transaction, and it can affect consumer engagement. So it's a really interesting dynamic that what's driving change today is it still should always be the consumer, but I think more often than not, the technology in terms of algorithms, not like TikTok, et cetera, are changing how marketers have to think about how they target consumers.
So, it's getting very complex to find the right people and put the right messaging in front of them. How do you approach your creative strategy to position your campaigns to succeed in doing that?
So if you go back 10, 15 years ago, people used to use words like mobile first. It's like, yeah, see, this guy laughed. I mean, it's like literally, the reality is a mobile phone is just a TV in your pocket. A TV is just an iPad on your wall. Like the reality is the ubiquitous of device has changed everything that we do over the last 15 years. So I think the reality is that as I think about planning, I first have to always start with the consumer. And I know that sounds generic, but if you don't, you miss the point. You miss the point of what am I ultimately trying? I'm trying to sell a soft drink to a consumer, a bag of crisps to a consumer. All these things matter. But I think what's important is, well, how are they then going to engage with my brand? Where are they going to shop first? Where are they going to hear my message? Who is going to influence them? What types of promotions? I mean, the world of promotions has changed. Like if I look at companies like Fetch, Ibotta, and all of these technology companies, they're fundamentally changing retail and consumer behavior through very basic loyalty metrics, which existed decades ago. But the reality is how you execute those loyalty metrics is totally different. So ultimately, you start with the consumer, then you just start with the channel and the audience that you're going after. But the thing that is probably more important today is actually thinking about what is the data that informs those decisions. Mm-hmm. We used to just use Nielsen data and media data from our media partners to make, let's say, 80, 90% of our decisions. Now you've got customer data. Now you've got first-party data. Now you've got third-party data. Now you've got data from other platforms. And then you got a whole bunch of amazing marketing platforms that you get zero data from. How do you manage that? So there's also a lot of gut. I think the reality is, marketing is true, art and science, but ultimately the science of growth is what actually builds brands. And if you can't use the data to actually target them better, then you're actually going to miss out on the consumer opportunity.
So in terms of the data points that you do have access to and aren't hidden behind, walled gardens and whatnot, how do you balance the immediate ROI of a campaign with the long-term brand equity that you're building? And how do you kind of think about that on a campaign-to-campaign basis?
So if you're talking equity, if we're really honest, measuring equity and ROI on what is traditional equity building channels and metrics is still pretty, I'll call it easy or traditional. You can use a marketing mix model. You can use econometric modeling to understand the drivers from an above-the-line TV basis. You can do different type of tracking studies and understand the impact from an equity basis. Then as you go down the funnel, it gets tougher, right? How do I measure the ROI of a sampling campaign unless I have a bounce back couponing program tied to some other retailer, tied to something else? It becomes super fragmented in the middle. And then at the end, there's a ton of data. If you think about it, there's so much opportunity, but the customers don't share, the platforms don't share. So then you have to find other unique ways to capture it. So the reality is, I do quarterly ROI analysis on all the money I spend in terms of the money I can track. But that is still very much traditional media. And it's social and digital based on mostly reach and resonance, not necessarily transaction. I think the future is about understanding the return on transactions and the return on engagements that ultimately result into sales. And it's not there yet perfectly. There are examples of it. I'm not saying they don't exist today, but the day that we can close the loop and actually understand that I got a sample here, I went to a certain store because I had a bounce back, I had this type of promotion that I can understand the return of the cost of that promotion, and therefore I bought X. That's the world that we've been talking about for probably 50 years. We're getting closer, but the fragmentation of how we, the platforms in which we market and the data fragmentation makes it really hard to truly measure the perfect ROI.
Makes sense. That's, something we're working to solve every day at iSpot. We touched on it in the beginning of the conversation a little bit, but, live sports in particular is getting really, really, really hard to track, and it's really fragmented. How do you view the shift away from linear? It seems like sports is kind of the last bastion in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, look, live sports, the one thing, and anyone that's a sports fan, how many of you watch recorded games? Not many. It's not as fun, right? And so this is why, from a linear kind of standpoint, live sports is always going to have a higher level of engagement. And there's brand affinity, and there's the authenticity of it. I mean, if you're a massive sports fan, you might watch it, but you're literally skipping through all the ads. You're not paying attention to all the logos that show up next to the score. But if you're hanging with your friends, having a pizza and a Pepsi, like you're more engaged, right? You're engaged in that moment. And so live sports, I think, will always have a very clear role to play. But then then what are the metrics within live sport? So Gatorade owns the sidelines. How do I measure that? Pepsi runs a TV ad. Lay's runs an engagement. I'm sampling outside of the stadium. All of a sudden, and I just put out a coupon tied to Papa John's, tied to XYZ at the same time. We're doing a DoorDash promotion tied to Baja Blast at the Super Bowl. They grew 400%. How do I measure that? These are the types of dynamics that we face every day. And by the way, all of what I just said was tied to a live sporting event. That's the crazy part. So I think this omni-channel is no longer just like how a retailer should think about how their customers buy. It's also about how we connect and how we target consumers throughout that, especially those live in real life moments like sport. You can always measure the impact of an ad. You can always measure the general value of LED signs, and those of you who work in sports know how it's calculated. But the reality is the ultimate value is how much sales came directly off of that investment. And I think now that because the fragmentation to retailers, to aggregators like DoorDash, to social and digital, to the influencer that's in the parking lot tied to the social program, it becomes a lot more harder.
If you could solve that, though, what a tremendous amount of value.
I wouldn't be sitting here. But that's the fun part, guys. Like, all of you are working in some part of this industry that's solving a problem. It might be a small sliver of a problem that a brand has or a company has, but it's still a problem. And I think the collective nature of the industry kind of connecting the dots, and we were talking about some of the stuff you guys do, ultimately, it's about finding that, that user journey or that viewer journey across different shows or different moments, and then being able to attribute whether it be equity or sales. And I think that's always the nirvana. We all want to have our own solutions and have our proprietary model. But as a brand guy, I just want one number. I'm not going to get it. But if we can kind of continuously look for unique ways to connect the dots across platforms, technologies, mediums, I think the ultimate goal is actually the consumer gets what they want when they want it. Brands see higher ROI. And data becomes the currency that we all actually are essentially trading off of.
Yep, makes sense. So I think, we've kind of woven it in as a consistent theme throughout the conversation. But what would you say is the biggest challenge that you guys at PepsiCo are working to solve? Is it that connection of data, or is there something else you guys are concerned with?
Look, I think... you have to break it down. So there's the broader business category dynamics, which I'm going to push over the side for a second. They're my day in and day out, right? I got to continue to evolve portfolios. I got to continue to evolve brands. I also got to, make sure that we're continuing to to think differently about how we spend our money. So like that business side is there. I think when you start to think about the media environment and the kind of marketing landscape, one of the biggest issues I face with is that there's not enough consistency as an industry on how we judge, measure, the tools we use. Like, you know, those of us who grew up, there was Bases and there was MMM and all these tools, and now it's like something else. And what it does is it confuses the industry a little bit. Like we all kind of look for that next big tool or that next big solution. The reality, they don't exist. So I think the hardest part is if I sit there, if I use the traditional tried and true metrics, people will say, well, they're a bit dated. They don't truly capture the omni-channel, more fragmented world. If I use a new metric, they'll say, oh, well, that's not proven. That doesn't really measure the true impact on sales, you know, and the reality is they're probably both right. So I think from a business standpoint, from a media standpoint, I mean, we spend a ton of money on media, but how we spend it is very different. The biggest question isn't about the what. What we do as marketers hasn't changed in decades. If we're really honest, we try to find a consumer insight, we try to create a product that delivers against a specific need, and we use marketing as a way to drive awareness and ultimately purchase. That's marketing. The what's the same. The how is incredibly fragmented. And it's just making everything a lot harder. So the more that the biggest challenge is like, what leaps am I going to take on the media side? What changes I'm going to make to my marketing mix? Am I going to totally move away from an entire channel of marketing? You know, like linear TV, general linear TV is not delivering the returns it used to. Live sport does, but it's really expensive. Digital and social works, but it's hard to measure. You know what's amazing? Radio, out of home are on fire. And when I say radio, it's streaming audio, it's podcasts, it's all that. But like, radio's cool. Like, who would have thought we'd be saying that in 2025, that radio is cool? But I think this is the kind of reality that we're facing, is that the changes in channel dynamics make it really hard. So as a pure marketer, I wake up, I do the basic stuff, the what's kind of the foundation, but the how is much more fluid. And I think that's where I think the industry, we all can help each other, whether you're on the buy side or the supply side. I think it's really changing how we look at, you know, ultimately the industry and marketing, but more importantly, how you build brands.
That's great. So as a final thought, you know, let's look at the flip side of fragmentation. Is there an opportunity in it that you see to move the industry forward? And how is Pepsi leading?
All right. So the biggest opportunity to make fragmentation not an issue is be simpler. Marketers overcomplicate the hell out of everything we do. We take a simple idea, we overcomplicate the creative. We take a simple product benefit for the point of distinction, we overcomplicate how we describe it, and we talk to consumers about it. I believe in a very simple premise, which is make simple special, right? Perfect example, Pepsi Challenge, okay? 50 years this thing's existed. We know why it works. We know how it works. It's proven based in many, many times. We've done it hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have done the Pepsi Challenge over the last 50 years. And it just is sampling. It's sampling. No, you know, people taste it, they like it. Next person, taste it, you like it. We happen to be 2/3 of the country, by the way, likes Pepsi Zero Sugar better than that other guy that the other guy was talking a lot about. But I think what's interesting is like it's sampling. So we took a sampling program, a very simple sampling program, and we turned it into a brand building, claim-driven engagement, comms, sell story, all of that just by going out and doing sampling. You know, another simple thing is like Gatorade. Gatorade just went back to, is it in you? It's a very simple idea. Literally, figuratively, it's a simple idea. If you drink Gatorade, you're hydrated. Is it in you? If you drink Gatorade or believe in the promise as an athlete and you have the confidence, is it in you? This idea, you know, the reason Just Do It works so well is because it's simple. The reason Think Different works so well is because it's simple. So if there's one thing I think that marketers just need to spend a bit more time is like, how can I get to the root of what is really unique and different about an idea? How can I actually execute with consistency? I think that's the other thing marketers we're all guilty of. We change shit every year. And there's this adage, just like you get a new associate, or you get a new CMO, they fire the agency, right? You get a new marketing director, they change the campaign. You get a new brand manager, they change the graphics. Like, you got to change something. You got to be famous for something. You got to PDR to check off of, right? So I think you just have to, that is human nature. We've all done it. Doesn't matter where you sit. But if you acknowledge that and you realize that actually the simpler I make it, the more likely I can repeat it, and the more likely people will understand it. And if people understand the benefit you're delivering, they value the brand that you've built in a consistent way, you will build loyalty, you will sell more, you'll win share, and ultimately you'll be less fragmented.
Words for marketers to live by.
I wish I did.
So we have a few minutes left. I think they'd like us to leave some time for Q&A.
Cool. Honestly, that's a perfect example of the focus and simplicity, okay? Poppy built its entire business on essentially word-of-mouth social media, right? What Allison and Steven did, you can just Shark Tank story, all that's amazing. But what they did is they just focused on girlsies, I think that's what they call them, and they just go consistently at them with a very simple product message, with a very product truth. They didn't change the product. A very simple brand proposition and a very specific target. So the biggest thing that we can do since we acquired Poppy, and I've spent a lot of time with those guys, and they're absolutely amazing. And the worst thing I can do is mess with anything they're doing. And actually, the one thing I need to do is learn from everything they're doing. Now, flip it to Pepsi, scale, multi-generational, multi-cohort, multi-brand, sub-brand platform. I need to actually do very different things to keep that brand relevant, which means focus on taste, focus on refreshment, don't change my campaign every 6 months, make sure that I've got value at retail, make sure I'm leveraging emerging channels like TikTok and others to actually bring new innovation. We dropped a gingerbread thing with Shaq like last winter. We didn't sell it anywhere. We just put it on TikTok Shop. It was fun. We gave away a bunch. Like that kind of staying connected with culture. But that is a different approach than Poppy sending 400,000 cans of sorority label cans all around the country. It's amazing. And by the way, there's no agency behind that. It's one woman and 12 girls on an internal team who all live, breathe that brand and have WhatsApp groups with like 300,000 sorority kids. And it's amazing. And I think, so that's a perfect example of like, let them continue to be focused. A lot of mainstream brands has a hard time connecting with young women. They've got it. What can I learn from how they engage, how they interact, and how they actually invest in brand building? It's a $500 million brand. It'll be $1 billion brand before you know it. We let it operate almost as a self, like there's operational efficiencies when you acquire a company. And so from a go-to-market, supply chain, distribution standpoint, that's the main focus. From a marketing standpoint, I'm involved. I make 0 decisions. The team who built it makes the decisions. They live, I was out at their sales meeting 2 weeks ago. It was amazing. Like everyone was wearing pink, like literally pink sweatsuits to a meeting. It was awesome, like 250 people. Like, so you gotta let that culture thrive. You gotta let them continue to build the brand as it works, because I think the one thing it's, any large company, if you acquire a brand and then you force it into your system, and we've seen this happen too often, you can destroy what made that brand special. So keeping it separate is one thing. Embracing them as part of those teams can learn so much from all the things we do, not just benefit from the scale of our company. So I think that's true of any, and by the way, it's true not just when you buy a brand, it's when you merge teams within an organization. Like, understand what made them special. Understand that unique skill set that is coming with them that you want to actually build on, not replace. And I think that's probably at its core. And then product-wise, it's a different product proposition. So it actually rounds out the portfolio quite well, which is a good thing. So I once made a statement that I actually truly believe. It says, the day I stopped learning, I stopped being a marketer. Okay? I teach at universities because I love it. Because I'm going up to Boston College next week to teach a couple classes. I do Georgetown. I've taught at different places. I get to learn from people who aren't my generation, who aren't from where I grew up, and all of those different backgrounds. So I think the number one thing we all have to do is be curious and ask questions and learn. And that sounds easy, for a junior marketer or a junior business person or a junior salesperson. It's actually more important for old guys like me. Because if I'm not in touch with culture, in touch with trends, or in touch with my kids, then how the hell am I going to be able to market to them? I've got an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old girl. The day the Poppy announcement, I used to have to literally take Poppy out of their hands. Like literally. And then it was Alani, but we've got a relationship now with Alani, so that's good too. But like I used to have to take product out of their hands and take it away from them. And then the moment the acquisition went through, I just filled the fridge with a whole bunch of Poppy. And what it helped me understand is the environment in which they operate, the way that they learn about brands. My daughter, one day I came home, she was drinking a mug root beer. She went and hid it. She didn't realize we owned mug. And then she goes, well, Mom told me that you didn't have it. And then I pushed all the Pepsi Zero aside, and there was a whole bunch of hidden mug. And so like this understanding how that generation thinks and actually the trade-offs they make in brands. And by the way, mug root beer. Root beer is one of the oldest flavors in the world. And it's on fire. It's one of the fastest growing CSDs in our portfolio. The category is growing. We're growing 3x it. Like, there's just so many things happening, which is very different than maybe what you would assume is happening in the traditional categories. The best way to find out, ask questions, hang out with people not your age, hang out with people not from the town you're from, go to the last place in the world you'd think you'd have, you'd spend time in, and enjoy it. That's the kind of learning that you need to do. We just got this, but I'm going to have one more question.
What brand and work outside of your category has inspired you recently?
I'm not going to do Apple, Netflix, all of those. I'd say New Balance. Chris Davies and the team there have really taken a family brand that's so ingrained in the Boston culture that is brought back through technology. They brought it back through simple kind of association with the kind of athletes and the teams, the values. They're very community-centric. If you look at their relation with Boston College, where my daughter goes, it's amazing. They're on all the jerseys, but more importantly, they're in the community. And if I asked you about New Balance a few years ago, 10 years ago, you would have put it like, below all the top brands. It's an emerging brand. So, I think there's always these underdog apparel brands who, again, consistent focus year over year gets you back on top, while others challenged with, maybe fragmentation or trying to get into every segment. So I think there's a good example. I think if you look at Coors, I think they're doing some cool stuff. Sophia and that team do an amazing job. So I think there's a lot of brands, but I think that there's a lot of smaller brands that we can learn a ton from. The Poppy example, their social media, their influencer, their grassroots is best in class. And I might be working for a big brand for a long time, but I can learn from a bunch of 26-year-old, super passionate, amazing marketers who just happen to work on a brand that I'm lucky enough to be part of today. So thank you, guys. Appreciate it.